Hi, and welcome to the 65th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. We've been charting the history of the Middle East since about 600 CE until the present, and we are actually going to cover issues within the lifetime of individuals here. So that's going to be fantastic. We're going to be going through the 70s all the way to the Abraham Accords. So very recent history, and hopefully that will be exciting to everybody. Now, the rules for those who are unfamiliar: this is not an academic presentation. I'm not an academician. I'm not credited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. That said, I want to give a secular presentation, by meaning I'm not going to try and bias to either side. I'm going to try and do a approach that analyzes each entity as a historical member in that sort of contingent situation. I also understand that this topic is very sensitive, so I'm going to invoke Will Wheaton's law. Let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I usually like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, this will more than catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. When I put dates, those are the years of service for political figures. If it's for a thought leader, then those are the dates of their life. And of course, common sense is really helpful here. If somebody has only 3 years in those dates, it's probably not their lifespan if they're a 25-year-old person. Now, this, like the other 64 entries in the Middle Eastern History series and all the other series, can be found on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can see those later. You can sort of attach different presentations along different trajectories. And that way you can sort of watch the unfolding, because I cover a lot of different places and a lot of different time periods. And of course, please join our meetup if you want to see upcoming events from not only the Middle Eastern History series, but from other series that we do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the 2 hours. And we really do appreciate donations. We have a premium Zoom account, a premium Meetup account, and a premium YouTube account, and all of those cost money. Now, we're going to continue to provide this series free of charge, but if you feel that this is something that is interesting, something that you enjoy, please help us to continue to bring this message to others. All right. So last time we sort of talked about 2 fundamental divisions that were occurring already in the nascent Zionist polity during the Mandate period, right? And we really see this sort of breakout in the 1930s, and we're going to follow some of these developments into the present. So it's important to highlight them once more. We talked about that there was a division between the new Yishuv, that is the settlers that were coming from Europe during the early 1900s, but especially between 1920 and 1939. And the old Yishuv, that is the population of Jews that was historically living in the region during the Ottoman period, excluding those settlers that came during the Ottoman period. And the old Yishuv tended to bond also with Jews from the Middle East and North Africa called the Mizrahim, or the Sephardim. And these Mizrahi or Eastern or Oriental Jews tended to have a different political outlook than did the European Jews. They were generally coming from a more mercantile context. Many of them had been merchants or traders, whereas many European Jews had been doctors, lawyers, and bankers. Of course, this is an overgeneralization, but generally speaking, because Jews from the Middle East were more involved with agriculture and with business, they adapted much more easily to the pre-Israel mandatory conditions, which were a much lower level economy. And one of the things that we talked about, especially in episodes 55 and 56, is that the new Yishuv, those Ashkenazi or European Jewish immigrants, had to discover what it meant to actually farm. And in the earlier iterations, they actually created a coexistence with the indigenous Arab population, where the Arab population would serve as their farmers because they didn't have the skill set. But we then shift to the political aspirations. And among the new Yishuv, there were 2 main political aspirations. You have labor Zionism on the left-hand side, represented by Dov Bar Borochov, and revisionist Zionism. And the fundamental distinction between these two was how they saw A, relationships with the Arab population, and B, the economic organization of the territory. The question of how to deal with the Arabs, the labor Zionists were much more accommodationist, generally speaking, with the Arabs. They thought that there could be a binational state or a state where Arabs play a key role. They didn't want to compromise on the state being a Jewish state, but they saw a place for Arabs in a secondary role existing within the confines of a Jewish state. They also, as time will go on, labor Zionism or left-wing Zionism tends to be more willing to go into a two-state solution, meaning that they would give land for peace. Especially in the wake of the Six-Day War, that becomes a more dominant position within their side of politics. On the revisionist Zionist side of politics, the view towards the Arabs was suppressionist, right? That Arabs should be defeated either militarily or through agreements. And therefore, there should be peace, but not necessarily for land. That was the fundamental distinction there. As concerns the economy, the labor Zionists tended to be more aligned with socialist institutions, labor unions, and other sorts of formal organized planned economics, whereas the revisionist Zionists tended to be more in favor of a market economy. In the early Zionist period of the labor Zionists, you have the creation of large-scale Israeli entities that exist today that are labor unions or are companies that are largely publicly owned. And so you have this phenomenon in Israel, starting from the early period, of a government-controlled economy. And we talked also about how during the 1960s, you had a strong degree of government-organized economic development. We also talked about how when the mandate ended, there was a conflict between the Jews of the state, both the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv had effectively become one entity by this point, and the Arab population. There was initially that division between the Arabs and the Jews, and through the conflict, which we really discussed in episode 56, the Israeli forces, which was that coalition of the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv and their various paramilitary organizations, were able to come together and effectively push out not only the indigenous Arab resistance, but the resistance from neighboring countries. And this resulted in inflows and outflows of people. So you had roughly 720 to 780,000 Arabs leaving the country, most of them going to the neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and to the Jordanian and Egyptian occupied regions of the former Mandatory Palestine, that's Gaza and the West Bank at this point. Those individuals are taken into the UNRWA system, which is a unique refugee system, and we're going to discuss a lot more about what that was and what impact that had on Palestinians next week. But for those populations that remained within Israel, you sort of had them divide into two camps. The majority camp was one that felt that this was a catastrophe and that there was really no way forward from this. And that is best represented by Tawfiq Ziad, who used poetry against the question of Israeli power. And you also have to realize that in this period, most towns where Arabs lived were Arab towns. They were not mixed towns. There are a few exceptions along the northwest coast of Israel. But generally speaking, Arabs tended to live in Arab majority or Arab exclusive towns, and those towns were under martial law, while the rest of Israel was under civilian law from 1945 until 1966. Now, there were Arabs that were part of the Israeli government, starting from the first Knesset, or the first parliament. Now, as I pointed out, the labor Zionists wanted to incorporate Arabs into the governing apparatus. And so the Arab parties that are represented at this point are ones that are created by the labor coalition. And there's a strong question about whether or not these individuals were representing Arab interests or whether these individuals were representing the interests of the labor Zionists just in an Arab skin. But Saifuddin Zobi is one of these Palestinian citizens of Israel who was represented in the Knesset and was part of the governing Mapai coalition. And of course, we can't just talk about outflows, we also have to talk about inflows. Between roughly 850,000 Jews left the Middle East and North Africa throughout this roughly the same period, especially from 1950 to 1957. Those populations ended up migrating to Israel in most cases. There were significant minorities that were able to go to France, the UK, Canada, and the United States, those four Western countries. But the bulk, at least 500,000 of those, ended up in Israel. And Israel had no place to put them. So they ended up in the Ma'burot, or the camps in the wilderness. Some of those Jews left in the sense by volition, as in they escaped. They were not pushed out from a military perspective, although you could definitely make the argument they were pushed out from a fear and economic perspective. And in other cases, like as you can see with the Jews of Yemen or the Jews of Ethiopia, they were actually airlifted out by the Israeli government in a number of difficult operations, because of course these were planes going to enemy countries to bring Jews out of those countries. One of the interesting things about the Middle Eastern Jewish community, this Mizrahi Jewish community, is that in many cases they tended to be more religious than the bulk of the new Yishuv, right? The new Yishuv was primarily coming from Europe. They tended to be rather non-religious in orientation. We talked about how religious Jews, generally speaking, did not see eye to eye with the Zionist movement until about the 1960s or 70s. The Mizrahi Jewish population ends up being the more religious population in Israel, certainly numerically speaking, than the Hasidic population in Israel that is much larger today relative to what it was back then, because Hasidim tend to have large families. But the difficulty in integrating the Mizrahi Jews in the Israeli context was primarily because of these religious distinctions, which a lot of the members of the new Yishuv dismissed as superstition or other kinds of backwardness. And this manifested in a lot of different ways and a lot of different issues for this community. The first one was that they were judged to not speak Hebrew properly, and a number of them were enrolled in Ulpan, or the Israeli Academy for Teaching Hebrew, and ended up surprising the instructors because their pronunciation, while different, was one of the correct pronunciations of Hebrew, and they had to prevail upon them that their accent wasn't somehow wrong or just somehow backwards, in much the same way that Southern US citizens have an accent that's generally not seen as educated or informed by Northern US citizens, and you have to overcome that stereotype. So that was one of the issues. Another similarity that you can see about how the thinking in the Middle East is different from the thinking among the new Yishuv in the Jewish populations is when we can talk sort of more narrowly about this Yemeni Jewish airlift. So these planes were bigger than anything that people in Yemen had seen. Yemen at this point, especially in the northern part of the country, was an isolationist country. As I pointed out in episode 60, Yemen is one of the few countries in the North Yemen is one of the few countries in the world that was completely neutral in World War II. It had no involvement in World War II. So that should show you just how cut off this area was. And the Israeli operation leaders were actually genuinely surprised that the Yemeni Jews didn't see a major issue with getting onto an Israeli plane that they didn't understand. And the mission commanders ended up asking the Yemeni, "Are you afraid? What's going on?" And they said, "Well, it says in the Bible that we'll be taken back to Israel on eagle's wings. Here are the eagles, let's get on." And so this religious understanding of reality, contouring to a scientific world, was something that was entirely normative, especially in Yemen, but also in other parts of the Middle East. Whereas in the Ashkenazi world, this was something that was not connected. They didn't see the Bible working in their day-to-day lives. And we can see that kind of distinction also in populations in the United States between those who are religious and those who aren't. We talked about how during the 1960s, as I mentioned before, Pinchas Sapir was able to coordinate the development of large-scale industry and foreign investment, in particular, the creation of the national water carrier. And this is a huge player in current domestic issues between Israel and several of its neighbors, especially since Israel is a country that took significant amounts of water from the Sea of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake, and pumped it throughout the country, starting from the north all the way down to the south. This is one of those situations that, ironically, today is changing because this entire water carrier structure can now be used backwards. With the desalination plants, you can actually see that this picture is from the desalination integration with the national water carrier, that desalination plants are actually pumping seawater into the Sea of Galilee after first desalinating it, and therefore increasing the levels of fresh water available for Israel's neighbors. But of course, during the 1960s until the aughts, Israel was a net remover of water from the Sea of Galilee in order to promote agriculture and human development throughout the areas that it controlled. We also talked about the beginnings of Palestinian resistance, if we can call it that, to the state of Israel. And this began with the Fida'i raids. These were individuals from Palestinian militant groups. These groups had not yet formed as a cohesive and organized entity, but these were individual militants that were often financed and supported by the governments of Egypt and Jordan. And these individuals would cross the borders of Egypt and Jordan with Israel, and required Israeli policing to hunt these individuals down and stop them before they would create havoc in Israel. And so this became the dominant form of Palestinian on Israeli attack throughout the 1950s. And we're going to see that sort of attenuate as Israel's border situation continues to change over the following decades. We also saw on the flip side that trying to maintain this sort of peace, this sort of difficult border situation resulted in Israeli massacres of Palestinian citizens of Israel. The worst one of these is the Kfar Qasim massacre in 1956, where 49 people, 50 if you include an unborn child, were killed by Israeli security officers who mistook them for Fida'i. There's a question of why didn't Israelis use water from the Mediterranean? Water from the Mediterranean is salty. You can't drink it. So that's why Israelis didn't use water from the Mediterranean. All right. And you also have to see Israel's position within the Cold War context. The initial act was for Israel to create what was called an alliance of the periphery. That meant having a good relationship with Turkey and a good relationship with Iran, which, of course, at that point was under the government of the Shah, the king of Iran. And so Israel was able to maintain this alliance. And it's called the periphery because in the near area, there were all those Arab countries that were antagonistic towards Israel, but Turkey had a neutral view or a slightly positive view towards Israel, given Israel's connection to the West. And Turkey had its own issues with the Soviet Union that forced Turkey into the Western sphere at this point. So that similarity kept them together. We also begin to see that because the Jordanians, through having a strong military relationship with the British, you can see General John Bagot Glubb, who was a British general serving in Jordan's Arab Legion, Jordan and Israel begin to have a certain degree of relations below the surface. In episode 57, we talked about how King Abdullah I of Jordan, who was assassinated in 1951, was assassinated trying to make overtures to Israel, possibly to create a ceasefire or a long-term non-aggression pact. And King Hussein, Abdullah I's grandson, who inherited power very soon after, understood that he couldn't make peace with Israel. That would completely undermine his monarchy. But he continued these underground channels and connections, and we're going to see how that ends up resulting in the Israeli-Jordanian relationship that we have today. At the same time that Israel was inching closer to the West, a lot of the Arab world, especially led by Egypt, was inching closer to the Soviet sphere. And while originally Egypt claimed to be a non-aligned power, along with India and Yugoslavia, Egypt slowly falls more and more into the Soviet sphere, especially with Soviet financing of the Aswan High Dam and the Soviet military support that they received in the War of Attrition that we talked about last time. So we have to remember that at this point, the dominant political perspective in the Arab world was Arab socialism. And we talked about this quite a bit in episode 63 and 64, where we talked about how Arab socialism manifested, how it became popular. And the key element here is the radio. And so because Nasser was able to control the airwaves and produce a language product that was simultaneously both Egyptian, it used modern Egyptian language, but understandable because it used a solid base of traditional Arabic words and grammar, it was understandable throughout the Arab world. And so Nasser effectively galvanized a whole revolutionary spirit throughout the Arab world. And we've seen echoes of how that displaced the monarchy in Iraq, how it nearly displaced the monarchy in Jordan, how in possibly derailing the Lebanese in 1958, the Syrians actually gave up their entire government in 1958 to the Nasserists, only to take it back in 1961. All of these movements convulsing throughout the Arab world were a strategic challenge for Israel, because if the Arab world could unite, that could pose a serious difficulty for Israel trying to hold back these different Arab states. One of the primary actions of Israel in terms of self-defense was monitoring the distinctions between the different Arab states and trying to look for ways to create alliances, non-aggression agreements, otherwise, in order to limit the amount of fronts that they would have to fight on. One of the other things that we addressed is the indigenous populations that are not Palestinians and not Jews in the context of the Mandate and the early Israeli period. And it's worth drawing a little bit of daylight also between the Christian populations as well. So most Arab Christians fall into the within the territory of the Mandate of Palestine were Greek Orthodox. And Greek Orthodox Christians in the Levant spoke Arabic as a primary language, lived much the same kinds of lives as Sunni Muslim Arabs, and by and large considered themselves part of Arab history. As we discussed in episode 63 and 64, when we talked about Arab socialism and Arab nationalism, a lot of the Syrian nationalists, and by Syria we mean Greater Syria, the entire Levant, the Syrian nationalists identified with the Levantine culture, and they identified that as being an Arabic-speaking culture that included both Christians and Muslims. They saw it that way, and they saw their history as intimately tied up with the history of the Muslims. If you look at Georgi Zaidan, for example, one of the earliest Arab nationalists, also a Greek Orthodox, he wrote specifically about Islamic history as being the foundational civilizational model that included both Sunni Muslims and Orthodox Christians. So there's not a lot of daylight within the Palestinian world, although we will talk about it next week in more detail, between Orthodox Christians and Sunni Arab Muslims who are settled. That relationship also is why the Druze felt so differently about the Yishuv than did those populations. The Druze had historically been the landowners, and these populations had been the sharecroppers. And so that economic consciousness, to the degree it existed, made the Druze feel distinctly separate from these two populations. Another distinction is that the Druze religion is a post-Islamic religion in that it has some fundamental Islamic tenets. It clearly comes from Ismaili Shiite Islam, but it has a number of differences that are substantial to the point where they don't consider themselves Muslims and Muslims would not consider them Muslims. You can think about it in many ways like the Mormons relative to Christianity. There's enough distinctions that they're sort of outside of the Christian fold, but there's certainly the imprimatur of Christianity on them. But because of these religious differences, there was a history of persecution and disagreement between the Druze and the Sunni Muslim Arab population. And so the Druze tended to be more in favor of the Yishuv than they were in favor of an Arab-led government. And that's what led to that blood pact that we talked about last week. The other Arab population that saw themselves as distinct from the Palestinians were the Bedouin. The Palestinians, generally speaking, were individuals who lived on farms and were sharecroppers. Accordingly, because the Bedouin were not sharecroppers and they lived nomadically, their relationship to the sharecroppers was often antagonistic. As most nomadic groups are around settled groups, there would be raids, there would be attacks to try and acquire resources from the settled populations, and then they would move to other territories. And because of this, the Bedouin had better relations with the Yishuv than the settled Arab population, the Palestinian population. And them, in addition to the Circassians, because of the common Russian history and similarity, Israel was able, the Yishuv was able to unify with these groups, and it was similar to the alliance of the periphery, where we saw that in a national context. This was in a subnational context. They were trying to create an alliance of the periphery. They knew that they couldn't necessarily get agreement from the Arabs, so they would go to the Bedouins, the Druze, and the Circassians. Now, there's a question of, I thought the Druze were a Gnostic sect. Yes, they are a Gnostic. Part of their differentiation from Islam is their incorporation of Gnosticism. Now you can see it as Gnosticism as one tree, right? And it has a number of different religions that have attached to it, some that are pre-monotheistic, some which are Christian, some which are Islamic, and so on. You can see it that way. Most people tend to see Gnosticism as something that a religion enters rather than a consistent religion of its own. So Islam and Christianity, their main strands, have generally eschewed Gnosticism, but Druze has accepted it. There are other Gnostic post-Islamic religions like Yarsanism. So it's not entirely unfounded, but it's something outside. There is, though, one group of non-Palestinian, non-Jewish that the Jews could not make a decent connection to, and was a group that felt solidarity with the Palestinians, and that was the Armenians. The Armenian population in Israel did not consider themselves Arab, but considered themselves part of that world. And accordingly, when interacting with the Yishuv generally ended up treating them very similarly to the Palestinians, and in the same way, they began to see their side as being connected. This has further entrenched with the modern relationship that Israel has with the Republic of Azerbaijan, which is the enemy of the Republic of Armenia. And Israel and Azerbaijan have a military alliance, which is an exchange of Israeli military goods for Azerbaijani oil and power, as well as support in anti-Iranian espionage. So because of that international relationship which developed in the 90s and the previous relationship that had existed within the territory, Armenians are generally more pro-Palestinian, both inside of Israel and outside of Israel. We also talked about the Suez Crisis, which was an Israeli military victory, but a Nasserist diplomatic victory because of the stance of the United States, which was in favor of the Nasserist position of annexing and nationalizing the Suez Canal over the Israeli attempts to take it. And then, of course, we had the Six-Day War, which was a massive Israeli victory over the various Arab states. And we discussed in detail how that was won. But the real turning point here is that Israel becomes part of the American sphere in a full sense after this war. This war proves to most American observers in the State Department that Israel, number one, is going to survive for a long period of time, and two, that Israel's interests align with the interests of the United States, especially as Egypt is falling more into the Soviet sphere, and Israel is able to take, to defeat Arab countries and take land. It also results in the Khartoum resolution, where the major parties on the Arab side refuse to make peace with Israel. That said, the UN Security Council Resolution 242 provided the grounds for which such a peace would be made. And this goes back to the division between labor Zionists and revisionist Zionists. Under UNSC Resolution 242, the way Israel could make peace with the Arab countries is that it could return territories taken in the war to the co-belligerents in exchange for peace. And a debate has always ensued between the Israeli side and the Arab side as to how to understand that. The Israelis say that peace should come first and the land will be ceded. The Arabs have said the land should be ceded and then peace will come. Now, there's a question here saying that I mentioned the Israelis planned this war for 5 years. I don't know that they planned it for exactly 5 years, but they had planned it for years, and they had a number of strategies that they were going to do. They had numerous maps of the Sinai Peninsula. They were key in terms of them knowing which routes tanks could go on and which ones they could not. They had information and spies placed in the governments of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in order to understand their defensive strategies as early as the late 1950s. And so Israel had been planning for an engagement for a very long time. And this just happened to be that engagement. They decided to fight it on their own terms. So after Israel wins this victory in the Six-Day War, and because of the resolution, Israel was now in military control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which are two territories of the Mandatory Palestine that were part of Jordan in the case of the West Bank, and Egypt in the case of Gaza. Now, under the Jordanians, the West Bank had been integrated into Jordan, and in fact, until 1987, so 20 years after they lost the territory, the West Bank continued to have representatives in the Jordanian parliament in Amman. The Egyptians did not do the same for Gaza. Gaza was under a puppet government from 1949 until 1959. And then from 1959 until 1967, it was militarily occupied by Egypt, but it was never integrated into the Egyptian state. Regardless, those individuals who lived in these territories were not able to get the citizenship of the parent country in a way that would make as equal citizens to the citizens who had not been in the Palestinian regions. In the case of Jordan, they were able to become Jordanian citizens as long as they stayed in the West Bank. In the Egyptian case, they were given their own basically worthless passports. So Israel's decision to put these territories under military occupation is not surprising, especially given in the case of Gaza, it had already been under military occupation. And in the case of Israel, remember that the Arab populations until 1966 had been under military occupation within Israel itself. That was abolished, and those areas were integrated into Israel proper, but they had experience running cities under martial law during that period. And so they just expanded that into the West Bank, and they put the entire territory under martial law. Now, there are a few reasons why Israel did this as opposed to a full-fledged annexation like Jordan had attempted. The first one was that UNC Resolution 242 had just come out, and Israel was hoping that they could come to some peace treaty relatively soon with the Arab states and therefore return these territories to the Arab states so that Israel would not have to rule over them. At the same time, Israel realized that, especially with regards to the West Bank, that it liked having control of these territories for two reasons. The first one is strategic depth. It's much easier to defend the Jordan River, which is an anti-tank ditch, effectively, than it is to be on the lower side of the Judean hill country, which puts them on an incredible defensive. Now, the other reason is that most of the historic Jewish sites are in what's today the West Bank. We're talking about the tomb of Rachel. We're talking about the tomb of Joseph. We're talking about a number of archaeological sites relating to the Davidic kingdoms. Almost all of these are in the West Bank. And so from a religious standpoint, it was much more difficult for Israel to make any clear statements about wanting to leave that territory untouched. The second reason that Israel put the territory under military occupation is that it noticed that Gaza and the West Bank had roughly enough Arabs to make a demographic challenge for Israel. And so putting those areas under occupation meant that any difficulties in terms of maintaining power would be felt in those territories as opposed to in Israel proper. And the third reason is that you begin to see Israelis wanting to live, especially in the West Bank, because of those areas of Jewish significance. So, in order to facilitate this, Israel begins to try and figure out how they can get the land in the West Bank without changing any of the laws that are indigenous to the West Bank. And the reason that they're under that secondary constraint is that a military occupying power doesn't have the right without annexation, and that annexation has to be recognized internationally, doesn't have the power to change the laws on the ground. So the Israelis went back to the Ottoman laws of 1858 and discovered that there were dead lands, with a reverter to the state. And so it classified all land that had not been owned by Palestinian individuals or by any political entity of Palestinians to be Arazi Mavet. And while those areas are not Area C, which is the map on the left-hand side, it's roughly analogous to that. So it should give you an idea of the extent of the size of the territory that Israel believed under the Ottoman Law Code of 1858 had a reverter to the Israeli state now in power. And it was that land that was offered to the settlers in order for them to create their settlements. So the settlements begin starting in the late 60s, but really begin to take off in the 80s and 90s. We also talked about the War of Attrition, which was Egypt's attempt to regain the east bank of the Suez Canal by simply running up the death toll of Israelis, shooting them from the far side of the west bank of the Suez Canal. This is the most entrenched the Soviet Union ever became in the Arab-Israeli conflict, with Soviet soldiers actively fighting alongside Egyptians against the Israeli positions. We also see here the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as such. Previously, Israel has been fighting Palestinians who are primarily financed by Arab states or organized by Arab states. This is the point where we start to see a turn in the the Palestinian organization, leading to the culmination of several different paramilitary and terrorist organizations. Foremost among them was Fatah, or the Conquerors. And the leader of Fatah was Yasser Arafat. Israel, wanting to deal a decisive blow, decided to cross into Jordan and do an operation in order to capture Yasser Arafat. Now, the operation managed to enter the city of Karame, the town of Karame, and some of the neighboring towns in search of Yasser Arafat, but they were not able to find him. Additionally, the Israelis met heavy losses once they were on the Jordanian side of the river, and this battle was seen by Jordanians as signaling that they were able to maintain Arab pride against Israel. And it was a diplomatic success for him, although a military success for Israel, similar to the Suez Crisis, right? we have to understand that with regards to Israeli battles and wars with its neighbors, anything less than a resounding success for Israel is generally seen as a positive for the Arab side. Now, the last war that Israel has with the Arabs is the Yom Kippur War. And this war was started by the Egyptians and the Syrians as a way of surprising Israel and getting the territory back that they had lost in 1967 without resorting to peace talks and truces. So you can see in the upper left-hand side, the Egyptian forces creating a pontoon bridge across the Suez Canal in Operation Badr and being able to take most of the east bank of the Suez. At the same time, the Syrians began an attempted invasion of the Israeli-held Golan Heights, and Israel was, although late to start the war, was able to repulse the Arabs, in fact, capture the Egyptian 8th Army on the west bank of the Suez Canal, resulting in a new ceasefire within the end of the month. From a domestic position in Israel, this was seen as a tragedy because of the Israelis being caught unaware. Remember that in 1967, Israel had had significant amounts of information, effective spies, key pieces of knowledge about what was going on in the region, and they had believed themselves to be in a position where they were able to continually deliver that level of high intelligence. Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel, had not reacted to the small bits of intelligence that they did have that an attack was imminent. And so she personally lost a significant amount of clout, but it also cast a specter on the Mapai coalition, that labor-led coalition of the Israeli government, for not having been able to foresee this eventuality. One of the developments that starts happening in the 60s and the 70s is an Orthodox Jewish rapprochement with Zionism. So we have to go back a little bit and remember that in the 19th century, the general Orthodox position with regards to any Jewish return to the land of Israel was that such an event needed the Messiah to happen, that the Jews had been expelled from the Holy Land because of their sinfulness, and only the Messiah would demonstrate God's acceptance that the Jews were once again fulfilling their covenant, fulfilling their laws, and were able to return to the Holy Land. And so when Israel became independent in 1948, less than 10% of the Ashkenazi population were non-secular. Forget Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, were non-secular. And so at that point, at the beginning of the creation of the State of Israel, a simple agreement was struck between Ben-Gurion and the other labor leaders, all secular Jews, with the Orthodox Jewish population, and the Orthodox were allowed to control the life ministries. We're talking about rituals around birth, rituals around marriage, rituals around death, all of these kinds of life cycle rituals. In turn, the Orthodox would be kept out, generally speaking, of the other ministries, except as elected through political parties. And those Orthodox Jews accepted the bargain, and that resulted in the current situation in the Israeli state with regards to life cycle rituals and similar. But in the 1960s, it increasingly became clear that Israel was going to continue, going to survive, and that it was a state that was run by Jews. And so you begin to see the Orthodox, while not accepting the idea that Jews have a right to create a state, right, that Israel was a state with a lot of Jews. And in the same way that Orthodox Jews have a positive view of the United States and the religious tolerance that it would afford them to practice their forms of Judaism, they would have that same sort of respect for the state of Israel and for their Jewish brothers and sisters who happen to live there. And there are two leaders in the Orthodox world who are really seen as motivating this change, although there were others. In the non-Hasidic community, in the modern Orthodox community, you had Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik and a number of other similar Jews. Again, Soloveitchik was one of the leaders of Agudat Yisrael, which is a political party now in Israel. I think it has about 7 to 10 seats in the Knesset, which is a union of Orthodox Jews. And he made basically the argument that I was just making now, that while the justification of creating a Jewish state doesn't exist outside of a messianic moment, Israel is a state created by Jews, and we should respect it as a state of Jews, not necessarily a Jewish state. You see also a similar view being espoused by Rabbi Menachem Schneerson within the Chabad Hasidic community. And he recognizes Israel in the same way as a large Jewish community, and he and Soloveitchik both put forward significant amount of resources in terms of creating yeshivot, or Jewish religious schools within Israel, for the cultivation of Orthodox Israeli communities. In the 1970s, you also have a massive class consciousness rising within Israel, and that is the consciousness of the Mizrahi Jews. Now, throughout the 1950s, you have the transfer of those 500,000 immigrant Mizrahi Jews. To put it in context, the entire Israeli Jewish population was about 600,000 before the Mizrahi immigration. So they are roughly on population parity with the Ashkenazi Jews. And in fact, because of birth rates, they are the majority of Jews within Israel in the 70s. Now, because of this situation in the 1950s of them being in camps in the wilderness and slowly being relocated to cities, they didn't have a political consciousness until really the beginning of the 1960s. And from their perspective, they saw the labor movement, the Mapai labor movement on the left, as being very opposed to them from an ethnic and cultural perspective. One of the distinctions, and I think it's very important to put this out here now, of Israeli politics relative to politics in most Western countries is that the left wing in Israel is generally perceived as being anti-immigrant and ethnically exclusive, whereas the right wing in Israel tends to be seen as more open, a wider tent. And this is what ends up happening. The Cherut party is formed, and the Cherut party is made of individuals from the Irgun, or one of the Jewish terrorist organizations that started in the beginning of the Independence War. Now, the Irgun was disbanded, but a number of its members had become part of the Israeli military, and after that point, they had become political individuals. And this party ended up campaigning directly to the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of the Middle East, as well as revisionist Zionists within the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And creating this broad coalition of Mizrahi Jews, who were generally the lower and lower middle classes within Israel, and more hawkish members from the Ashkenazi community, they were able to win the Prime Ministry of Israel in 1977 under Menachem Begin. This was the first time in Israeli political history that the opposition had won, because previous to this point, Labor and its governing coalition had managed to control the direction of the state. We also have to put into context the kind of discrimination that the Mizrahi Jews were facing within Israel during this period, and this would continue until probably about the mid-80s. The first thing was, as I pointed out earlier, that their particular customs, such as using different types of amulets, having distinct prayers or specific holidays, like, for example, the Ethiopians celebrate the Sigd. Their behaviors were seen as strange, quirky, and otherwise worthy of mockery. And on the other side, because they were not educated as lawyers, bankers, and doctors from a European context, they were seen as being unlettered, despite the fact that they had had significant real-world experience in their countries of origin, and were dedicated workers in the various professions that they did choose and did take. Another piece was that their history wasn't well known to the Ashkenazi Jewish community. Discussions about what Jews had been doing in the Middle East and North Africa didn't really make the pages of Ashkenazi textbooks, didn't make part of the Israeli curriculum. And so a change towards that began in the 1990s and aughts. But you can see in the middle of this period how they would side with a party that was more inclusive of them and promised them the ability to become more economically astute in the future. So while we've been talking about this Israeli context in the 1970s, we also need to talk a little bit about the Palestinian context. And we're going to definitely go through this in a lot more depth next week. But an important point to make is that after the Battle of Karama in 1968, the Palestinians attempted to take power in Jordan for themselves, right? The Jordanian monarchy is a monarchy that is, ethnically speaking, Saudi Arabian. They come from the Hijaz region, very close to Mecca and Medina. So given that the Jordanian population was majority ethnic Palestinian by this point, a number of the Palestinian leaders, like Yasser Arafat, believed that they could take power into their own hands. And so they launched a rebellion against the Jordanian government. The Israelis provided Jordanians clandestine assistance in helping them put down this Palestinian rebellion, believing that their lukewarm ties with the Jordanian monarchy at that time, which would eventually blossom into a peace treaty, would be a better starting point than trying to negotiate with which they had no serious connections. After being defeated in what's called Black September, which was a war of 8 months, the Palestinian Liberation Organization began to jump all around the Middle East, and the place where it ended up surviving the longest was southern Lebanon. That's where they made their headquarters in 1978, and you can already see them mobilizing within the context of the Lebanese Civil War by 1979. So 1979 is a pivotal year within the development of Israel's external diplomatic relations. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, makes a groundbreaking flight to Jerusalem to negotiate with Menachem Begin. And even though Begin comes from the revisionist Zionist camp, that camp of refusing to give land for peace, he gives land for peace. And in fact, this is a consistent irony of Israeli politics, that almost always the revisionist Zionists who campaign on not giving land for peace are the ones who are willing to give up land for peace, whereas the labor simply don't manage to get those agreements signed. So President Carter facilitates this agreement in Maryland's Camp David, and in March of 1979, the treaty is finalized. Now, the Israelis will have a phased withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, starting in 1980 all the way till 1982 in those different strips. One of the things is that the Israelis had begun to extract oil from the Sinai when they had been in occupation of it. So necessarily that meant that they wanted to hold on to the territory as long as possible in order to continue that extraction, but also to dismantle those settlements prior to returning it to the Egyptians. The other major change in 1979, of course, was that Iran was no longer going to be part of the Israeli periphery, because the Islamic Revolution in Iran was explicitly anti-Zionist. Ayatollah Khomeini, who took power by October of 1979, began popularizing anti-Israeli beliefs from the Iranian seat of power, and he began to project influence into other regions of the Middle East. This is what sparked, of course, the Iran-Iraq War, although Iraq was the one to fire the first shot there. I love this slogan here on the right-hand side. If you know Persian, Hebrew, or Arabic, you can see that the first word is death. But of course, they translate it as down with Israel, because I guess that sounds nicer than death. But that's generally what we end up seeing from Iran. And so that alliance where Israel has secured its petroleum from Iran, which was critical during the Six-Day War, critical during the 1973 war as well, that goes offline. And so part of the agreement between Sadat and Begin is that the Egyptians will sell Israel oil in order to allow them to continue to be safe. And the peace treaty also means that the Palestinians who had previously used the Egyptian border as a source of fidai in the 1950s and 60s could no longer use that border. And in fact, up till this day, we've seen intense cooperation between the Egyptian military and the Israeli military on dealing with insurgents within the Sinai Peninsula, mostly from indigenous Bedouin, and with regards to the Gaza Strip. And it's worth taking a second to talk about the Gaza Strip, because the Gaza Strip, as we mentioned, was under Egyptian occupation prior to 1967. But as a result of Camp David, Sadat did not want it back. He allowed it to remain in Israeli control, and no provisions were made for the future of it. So we begin to see a marked shift within the Arab world of the politics that is ascending, because this peace treaty in 1979 with Israel really shows that the Arab socialists have failed. 1967 showed that quite strongly, but this was the final nail in the coffin. And so a lot of leaders from the Arab socialist camp stopped being Arab socialists in the sense of trying to advocate for the socialist reforms, trying to create a unified pan-Arab sentiment. All of this goes out the window. And the primary issue that they're dealing with now is Islamism. And Iran's becoming an Islamist state. And by the way, Islamism is theocratic Islam, right? The governance of a country in accordance with Islamic law, if that's a modern nation state. Iran's turn to Islamism was deeply threatening to both the monarchies and the republics of the Arab world. And so you have what I call the Chaldeoization, where leaders who were military leaders like Sadat, like Hafiz al-Assad, began to concretize their power as military strongmen and stopped espousing the doctrines and ideologies of Arab socialism in order to justify their rule. They used their explicit power to justify their rule. And they began incredibly suppressionist actions against any Islamist organization. The foremost of these is the Muslim Brotherhood, including its Palestinian chapter, which is Hamas, right? Hamas is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. But within Egypt, both Sadat and Mubarak, his successor, worked tirelessly to eliminate Muslim Brotherhood cells within the country. And Hafiz al-Assad did similarly. Jordan, because of its actions in Black September in 1970, was able to quash any potential Palestinian resistance organization from forming within that context. But of course, we have to remember that Jordan has a military that is entirely separate from the Palestinian majority of the country. That is to say that it's made of primarily Bedouins and Circassians, both of whom have a long history of fighting Sunni Muslims, settled Sunni Muslims. And so Jordan didn't need to resort to a Chaldeoization because it was already in a situation where the monarchy had its own form of legitimacy, entirely separate from the programs it ran. Right? It had dynastic legitimacy. So now that we've entered the 1980s, there's a massive fundamental change within the Israeli system. And that change is that Israel now is under the control of a revisionist Zionist government. And that government begins to be more right-wing in terms of its economic policy, meaning that you begin to have changes in terms of the way the economic system is structured. It's going to become more of a market economy. Now, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange had existed even before Israel became a state, but a number of major Israeli companies had never been on the stock exchange because they were run through the Histadrut, that socialist organization that had large major companies in it, like Solel Boneh, like Tzim, like Klalit, like Bank Hapoalim. All these organizations were owned by the Histadrut, and when Israel became a state, became publicly owned corporations. But there was a wave of privatization, and contrary to what happened in a lot of other socialist or quasi-socialist countries that began with privatization, these organizations were not simply given to the wealthiest Israelis to run as oligarchs. these were divided into shares and stocks and put on this Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And so you had this new process where Israelis were learning to invest in their own corporations and begin to fuel their own corporate growth. This was, unfortunately, what led to the Israeli banking crisis of 1983. And Yaakov Levinson is probably the most famous individual. He was from Bank Hapoalim, the activists' bank, but all four of the major Israeli banks at the time participated in this. And it was where they drove up demand for their own stocks by telling their clients to buy stocks. And so that drove up the value because of artificially inflated demand. And it led to a crash in the stock market in, as I said, 1983, that resulted in a massive amount of inflation. Israel had to completely re-engineer the stock market, re-engineer its currency, which is why you have the new shekel starting in 1986. The Israeli shekel, I think, was inflated to something like 10,000 or 100,000 to 1 relative to where it had been in order for the new shekel to really, and that's why the new shekel was needed in order to stabilize the economic situation. You also have the beginning of Israeli-built investing apparatuses. You can see the Jerusalem Venture Partners. They came around in 1993, but they are one among many different organizations within Israel that began to create large-scale capital funds in order to inject both foreign and domestic capital within Israeli companies and provide the seed money that would lead to many smaller companies developing. One of the other things that's worth pointing out, especially as you move more into the aughts, is that while the Histadrut had numerous labor requirements and standards for large-scale companies and corporations, they had never envisioned creating a labor union system for small companies and for startups. They also had very little in terms of organization for newer industries. They had a number of things for traditional heavy industry, agriculture, light industry, but not for technology. And so that startup point where you have small companies that are involved in modern technologies was literally something that for which the Histadrut never had a competence. And so this new market economy, fueled by venture capitalists, joined by large-scale investors, joined by stock market proliferation, meant that Israel was in a position to uniquely expand in the technological sphere and create numerous startups because of minimal overhead relative to other industries, pushing more labor in that direction, as well as an increasing investment by the young population in those fields because they were able to receive money more effectively. We also see the beginning in Israel, for much the same reason, of scientific movements, even as early as the 80s, where, for example, the Weizmann Institute of Science becomes one of the world's foremost institutes in biological sciences, pharmacology, and also chemical and physics-based sciences, where Israel becomes a leader among Western countries in terms of these fields because of the increasing investment within the Israeli economy, both from Israelis and from outside of the country. Somebody confirmed it was 1,000 to 1 was the revaluation of new shekels to old shekels. The inflation, I think, was a little stronger, though. All right. Now, from the late 1970s into the 1980s, we have a number of smaller operations that Israel is engaged in. Even though the era of the large-scale Arab wars is over, these smaller battles or operations persist. And I just wanted to sort of highlight 3 of them. In 1973, there was a hijacked airplane with a significant number of Israeli passengers, 106 Israeli passengers. And it was hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and flown to Uganda. Now, one of the ironies, of course, Uganda at this point was ruled by Idi Amin, who was empathetic to the Palestinian cause. But what he forgot is that the airport where the terrorists were holding all the victims was actually built by Solel Boneh, one of these large-scale Israeli production companies. And so Solel Boneh provided floor plans to the Israeli government in order for the Israeli government to launch a raid on that facility. Now, to put into context, Uganda is incredibly far from Israel. It's about 8-hour, 9-hour flight. So this required in-air refueling, which was generally speaking a rarity at the time. And the Israelis were able to make it out with only 3 hostages lost and only the lead commander, Yonatan Netanyahu, the brother of current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, dying in the rescue attempt. Another one worth pointing out is that in 1981 you had Operation Opera, which was an Israeli fighter jet attack on the Osirak reactor in Iraq. This was a French and Iraqi-made nuclear reactor. And Israel was under the impression that this would be used to create nuclear weapons. It was part of a weapons program by Saddam. Somebody's correcting me that it was 4th of July 1976 for Operation Entebbe. Thank you. And there's a question: does Israel have a good chemical and biological defense apparatus? I don't know how you can have a good defense apparatus for biological and chemical weapons. They have gas masks, but I don't know how you would defend against biological and chemical weapons. But Osirak was critical in terms of preventing Iraq from acquiring weapons of mass destruction, and B, demonstrating to Arab countries that would try and use this as an end run around Israel that Israel was willing to strike, was capable of striking. And in fact, this is one of the major reasons why countries like Iran have built their nuclear facilities underground. The possibility of Israel launching a long-distance bombing raid is not zero. They've clearly done it before. We also have the beginnings of the Lebanon operations. And so before Israel was fully integrated into the Lebanese Civil War, and we're only going to see the Lebanese Civil War today from the Israeli side, there were attempts by the Israelis to work with the Southern Lebanese Army, the South Lebanon Army, which was a fascist army of Maronite Christians. And Israel saw that these groups had a similarity in terms of being a non-Muslim population, being afraid of a large Muslim contingent that they were surrounded by. And so they began to have a number of meetings in the area just south of the Litani River. Now, we also see that because of Israel's increasing orientation in Lebanon and the Palestinian centrality in the Lebanese Civil War, that Palestinians based in Lebanon begin to attack Israel. So Dalal Mughrabi was one such individual. She's considered a martyr by the Palestinians and a terrorist by the Israelis. She led a boat onto the Tel Aviv beach. Once there, she ended up taking a bus with hostages. The bus eventually exploded. Israel argues that it was a Palestinian suicide bomb. Once they realized that the Israelis were going to take it, the Palestinians argued that the Israeli attack helicopter shot it. Regardless, over 70 Israelis were killed. And almost all of the Palestinians, only 2 of them from her group, herself not included, survived. The goal had been to attack Tel Aviv, maybe plant the Palestinian flag. It's unclear how effective she thought she was going to be. But regardless, this is one of the last cases of what is effectively a fidai, right? Somebody coming across the border, firing shots and trying to cause panic by attacking the civilian population. From this point forward, we're really going to see a shift within the Palestinian world of how they're going to fight the Israelis. Because the Fidai system isn't going to work when Egypt has a border with Israel that's agreed to with truces. The Jordanians are increasingly working with Israel and not supporting Fidai within their own territory. The Syrians don't have an easy access to Israel because there is, after 1973, a United Nations controlled zone, so it's hard to sneak people through. And the Israelis are patrolling the border with Lebanon because of this relationship with the SLA, which of course, as you can see from its name, is controlling significant areas of southern Lebanon. All right. So now we get into the thick of the Lebanon War, and Israel really doesn't get directly involved until 1981. And you can see at that point, the Palestine Liberation Organization controls significant portions of southern Lebanon. And that put them very close to those Israeli villages. The PLO begins to attack Israeli villages on the Israeli side of the border, and so Israel launches an invasion in coordination with the South Lebanon Army. That army is responsible for a number of anti-Palestinian massacres, probably most famous of which are the Sabra and Shatila massacres of 1982. These were conducted by the SLA. However, Israeli military forces patrolled the area and prevented any other groups from coming to assist the people in Sabra and Shatila, which allowed those massacres to occur. And so Israel and the SLA are both held somehow jointly responsible for what happened there. The leading Israeli representative with respect to the Lebanon Civil War was Ariel Sharon, who was Minister of Defense from 1981 to 1983. And he had fomented a relationship with Bashir Gemayel, who was one of the leaders of the South Lebanon Army. Now, there were a number of different Lebanese Maronite organizations that were operating in quasi-alliance with the State of Israel in the wider context of the Lebanese Civil War. And the Lebanese Civil War basically breaks down into three general categories. Again, we're going to get much more in depth with this when we do Lebanon at the end of March. But there are those that are pro-Maronite, there are those that are pro-Sunni, and those who are pro-Shiite. The Syrians end up being pro-Shiite, generally speaking. And so we have this situation where the Israelis are fighting on the side of the Maronites, on the side of the Christians. And so we have a significant amount of coordination. That said, Bashir Gemayel wanted to be the sole point of coordination for the Israelis, and this caused a lot of tension on the Israeli side. That said, Israelis trusted Gemayel to hold his word, which was not something that they could say for a lot of the other commanders that they were working with. And when Gemayel was elected to the presidency of Lebanon in 1982, Ariel Sharon demanded that he conclude a peace treaty with the State of Israel as part of their alliance. Gemayel countered that he could give them a non-aggression pact, but he couldn't give them a peace treaty. Ariel Sharon was not impressed and refused to accept a non-aggression pact. Unfortunately, by September of 1982, Bashir Gemayel was assassinated by a number of Shiite-aligned individuals, and his brother Amin became president. Amin Gemayel in 1983 was able to actually conclude a peace treaty between Lebanon and Israel. However, after basically signing the peace treaty, he was removed from power because of internal issues within Lebanon, and the successor government refused to implement the peace treaty. So Israel is still in a state of war with Lebanon, and that peace treaty has been dissolved. Israel retained the southern areas of Lebanon. You can see that area called the Israeli Security Zone. Israel retained those southernmost portions of Lebanon under occupation from 1985 until 2000, when Ehud Barak withdrew them, facing increasing attacks from the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah. After the Israelis pulled out of Lebanon, we began to see a fundamental shift in the way that the Palestinians in the West Bank would act. Now, between 1967 and 1987, there was resistance at a small level within the Palestinian territories against the Israeli occupation, but generally speaking, the borders between the West Bank and Israel were open. Palestinians came into Israel and worked as day laborers. But in 1987, you started seeing a new form of attack, which was the suicide bombing. In fact, the first suicide bomb was in 1989, and they continued after that point in larger and larger numbers. They were led by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was Fatah and a number of other smaller acolytes that stood together. And these were responsible for several thousand Israeli deaths, as well as, of course, Palestinian deaths. And there was Israeli retributive violence within the territory. This could include things that are as nonviolent as setting up checkpoints to destruction of people's homes, collective punishment, and other sorts of activities against the Palestinians. In 1993, they were able to conclude with Yasser Arafat the Oslo Accords, which ended this first intifada and divided the West Bank into different zones. Zone A, which would be under full PLO administration, Zone B, which would be under a PLO civil administration, but under Israeli military authority, and Zone C under exclusive Israeli military authority. In light of this, in 1994, the Jordanians were willing to sign a peace agreement with Israel, contingent on Israel continuing to negotiate with the PLO or any other representative of the Palestinians for the process of creating a Palestinian state in the West Bank. Within Israel, at this same time, during the late 80s and early 90s, we begin to see a new religious community developing in Israel. Not new in the sense that they hadn't existed before. They certainly existed from the early days of the state. If we remember, most of them see Rabbi Avraham Kook as their ideological grandfather, but they were a very small portion until the 1970s and 80s. And this is the Datei Leumi in Hebrew, or the religious Zionists. And this is a new community. As we pointed out, within the Orthodox community, there was a general disdain towards Zionism as a concept. Now, they were willing to support Israel as a state of Jews, but not as a Jewish state. The religious Zionists, or the Datei Leumi, are not that. They are supporting Israel as a Jewish state, and they further want to push it in a Jewish religious direction. So we begin to see a number of West Bank settlements being formed by these Datei Leumi. We also see the creation of a political party, first based in the United States and then being expanded into the Israeli territories, both Israel proper and the West Bank. And that is Kach Kahane Chai, which was based on Meir Kahane, an American Jewish rabbi who believed that no negotiation with the Palestinians was possible, that Israel was the holy land of the Jews, and that the Palestinians should be either expropriated or exterminated. Now, this position, of course, directly contrasted with that of Labour Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was creating a land for peace deal of sorts with the Palestinians in the Oslo Accords of 1993. So this led to an ideological clash between these groups. And you have one religious Zionist, Yigal Amir, who is a Yemenite Jew ethnically, but was brought into this movement. And he considered that what Rabin was doing was going to put Israel to death, was going to lead to the destruction of the state. And so he assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in order to prevent, quote unquote, him from killing Israel. In order to do this, he cited the Jewish rabbinical doctrine of Rodef, or the pursuer, that a Jew has a requirement to kill a person if that person is going himself to kill another person, and you know for certain that this is going to happen. No Israel accepted this position, and Yigal Amir has been imprisoned for the murder of a prime minister. He is still alive, but imprisoned. The Datei Leumi movement was also the inspiration behind the 1992 attack on Hebron by Baruch Goldstein, where the Palestinians in that case actually clobbered him to death after they were able to surround him. But unfortunately, he took a number of people with him. The Israeli government, because of these kinds of activities, banned the Kahane Chai movement. And to date, as far as I'm aware, somebody in the comments can correct me, I think this is the only political party that has ever been banned in the Israeli context. Israel has had communists in its Knesset. Israel has had Islamist Arab parties, but this was considered a step too far. So starting in 2000, we had a return to a more right-wing orientation of government, and there's a reason for that. So the Labour Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, had tried to make a number of negotiations with the Palestinians at Taba in Egypt in September of 2000. And those negotiations had been for most of the West Bank, excluding some small areas, including giving the Palestinians the old city of Jerusalem, which was technically part of the West Bank under UNSC Resolution 242. He also withdrew the Israeli military presence from Lebanon that we talked about earlier, and made a number of other overtures. These were increasingly seen by the Israeli public as undesirable, and so he decided to allow the Israelis to vote on whether he should continue as prime minister or not. So he resigned and then ran for an election. It was a resounding loss for Ehud Barak and the Labour coalition more generally. In fact, since Ehud Barak, Labour has never been the dominant party of an Israeli government since. And the revisionist Zionists were able to take power in that period, led by Ariel Sharon. Now, prior to that, in September of 2000, Ariel Sharon went to Al-Aqsa Mosque, that is the Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount, and because of that, caused a lot of reaction from the Muslim population, both within Israel proper, within the West Bank territories, and more generally. This was seen as the provoking event from the surface of the Second Intifada, or the Second Palestinian Uprising. Now, there are conflicting evidence that shows that the Palestinians had been planning to have a Second Intifada for quite a long period of time, and they needed an instigating event. And this was simply chosen as an instigating event. Regardless, starting in 2000, we have the Second Intifada, which is characterized primarily by suicide bombings. And so this becomes the dominant method for Palestinian attack, because with the Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank and control of significant portions of the West Bank, right, those Area C areas delimited by the Oslo Accords, it's very difficult to get what is clearly a gun across the border and into Israel, but it's much easier to get a backpack in with explosive devices. So what you end up having is a number of these attacks. The Israelis go in several operations, like Operation Defensive Shield, where the Israelis go into different villages in the West Bank, and a number of refugee camps as well, also areas in Gaza, in an attempt to put down the Intifada and limit its ability to perpetrate suicide attacks on Israelis. We also have the construction of the separation fence, or the wall. Most of the barrier is a fence, about 5% of it is a wall, but you can see, for example, this is the wall as it cuts through Abu Dis, which is the closest Palestinian town in the West Bank to Jerusalem. And so because it is so close in proximity, the Israelis made this part out of concrete, but the majority of it is a see-through fence. Regardless, the fence served as an effective barrier towards the end of the Intifada in preventing suicide bombers from crossing from the West Bank into Israel proper, and was considered by the Israelis to be one of the major reasons that the Intifada stopped in 2005. Another major reason possibly that the Intifada stopped in 2005 was Sharon's unilateral disengagement plan. Now, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see a map of Gaza with certain blue areas. Those blue areas are Israeli settlements within Gaza. They are far less numerous than those in the West Bank, because Gaza is one of the densest populations in the world. That entire territory has over 2.4 million people in it. To give a sense of how dense it is denser than New York City in terms of population. So Israel decides under Sharon that protecting those particular settlements in the Gaza Strip is not worth it from a military perspective. And so it forces an Israeli withdrawal from those territories, and either resettlement in Israel proper or resettlement in other West Bank settlements. This is not done in consultation with any Palestinian government operating in the Gaza Strip. At that time, it was a PLO government. But Sharon operated from the perspective that it would be better for the Israelis to do this. Now, Hamas and other militant groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad that were operating in Gaza saw this as a victory against the Israelis, that they had managed to push the Israelis out of territory that they had occupied, and that this would be the first in many Israeli withdrawals from the entire territory of the former Mandated Palestine. The settlers themselves were, in many cases, opposed to this withdrawal, and while some of them left quietly, others of them fought back against the Israeli military. And you can see an indication there. The settlers are wearing the orange shirts, and the Israeli military is now covered with some kind of foam that they sprayed at him. We then shift after 2005 into 2006. And Hezbollah believed that they could begin a war of attrition with the Israelis by attacking Israeli border positions and taking captives. So they crossed the border and took the captives, Regev and Goldwasser. Those were the last pictures that we have of them alive. And Israel retaliated with a large-scale strike on most of the Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. This war has often been called the war with Lebanon from the Israeli perspective, the 2006 Israeli-Lebanese war in international spheres, the Second Lebanon War, if you're comparing it to the First Lebanon War, and a number of other names. But it existed primarily for a few months of 2006. And the war primarily was an Israeli ground and air invasion of southern Lebanon, the dropping of numerous munitions and attacks against Hezbollah militants, and Hezbollah firing Soviet-made Katyusha rockets into the northern third of Israel. And you can see those areas that have been attacked from the Katyusha rockets in the map, and you can also see where Israel has dropped bombs. Israel also began a naval blockade of Lebanon to prevent the incoming of supplies that would reinforce Hezbollah. Now, one of the difficulties that the Israelis had at this point was that Hezbollah was fully integrated into the local communities. If you interpose an ethnic map of Lebanon with the areas that were under attack, it's very quick to see that the majority of the Lebanese in this area are Shiite Muslims, and therefore Hezbollah was able to create a sympathy between themselves and that community. They also argued that they were responsible for forcing the Israelis out of this zone. Remember, the Israelis maintained an occupation of southern Lebanon from 1985 to 2000. And so Hezbollah was seen as the liberators. So because of this, you had situations where numerous civilian villages that existed throughout the southern part of Lebanon were part and parcel of the Hezbollah organization, and Hezbollah would withdraw into these villages, making it harder for Israelis to pursue them. At the same time, Hezbollah was able to strike key victories against Israel in terms of delaying their tanks, being able to destroy Israeli infrastructure. And so while Hezbollah was not able to, for example, invade Israel proper or launch a sophisticated attack against Israel beyond the launching of these Katyusha missiles, it was considered by many to be a Hezbollah victory, because eventually Israel came to the negotiating table, and Israel made exchanges of several prisoners to Hezbollah in exchange for the end of the conflict, and what ended up being the bodies of Regev and Goldwasser. From 2006, we see a pivot in terms of Israel's attention, and the attention goes back to the West Bank and Gaza. In 2006, they have one of the few free and fair elections in the history of the Palestinian people. And in that election, Hamas and Fatah run against each other as two political parties. As you can see, Fatah in yellow overwhelmingly loses that election to Hamas, and Hamas is running on a platform of increased violence against the state of Israel, increased resistance towards the state of Israel, and Fatah is running on a historic continuing of the current policy. But there's a second thing that's also in the election that motivated a lot of the Palestinian vote, which is that Fatah was known to be corrupt and known to be very nepotistic, which meant that most Palestinians didn't have an ability to rise beyond their station. And so Hamas won this election, and this caused a civil war within Palestine between Fatah and Hamas, Fatah not wanting to cede power and Hamas willing to take it. Now, in the West Bank, because the territory that the Palestinians control is so thoroughly divided by Israeli checkpoints and Israeli occupied Area C, Fatah was able to hold power because Israel prefers Fatah to Hamas. In the Gaza Strip, where Israel had unilaterally disengaged in 2005 and therefore had no positions inside, the territory was unified. Hamas was able to militarily steamroll Fatah and therefore divide the Palestinian territories between two Palestinian authorities, lowercase a. Now, there's a question of who funds Hamas. At this point, Hamas was primarily funded by the Gulf states. Today, Hamas is primarily funded by Iran, but the Gulf states also contribute. So this begins a number of wars between, or quasi-wars. Some people see it as one continuous war that has certain flare-out periods and certain cooling periods. Starting from 2008 until the present, with Hamas. And they have a number of different Israeli operational names. They're often just called the Gazan War of insert year here. And these wars result in Israeli military attacks on the Gaza Strip. And similar to Hezbollah, you have Hamas being built into civilian areas, so you have high civilian casualties. You also have allegations of Israel intentionally attacking civilians. So you have those two things existing in tandem. But the numbers of casualties are wildly disproportionate between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. Some of these conflicts are brought on by similar events to what happened in the Hezbollah case, where, for example, Regev and Goldwasser were taken. In this case, Gilad Shalit, who was eventually returned in a prisoner swap for roughly 1,000 Israeli-held prisoners. But Gilad Shalit was taken by Hamas, and you can see this propaganda poster from Hamas, which says, Asrana al-Abtal, forward for our heroes, Kol Am wal Gilad Jadid, which is sort of a play on Kol Am wa Antum Bakhair, which is sort of a New Year's greeting. So if I translate this roughly, it would be, it's a great year, and we're going to get a new Gilad, right? We're going to kidnap another Israeli soldier, to sort of make the argument that Hamas was able to strike at Israel where Israel feels weakest, which is that Israel needs to find the bodies of all of its soldiers. Israel doesn't believe in an MIA policy, missing in action policy. One of the largest military developments that Israel makes over the course of the Gaza wars, especially in Operation Protective Edge of 2014, is that they perfect the Iron Dome system, which is a system of small miniaturized rockets that are able to intercept the rockets coming from the Gaza Strip and effectively neuter the ability of the Palestinians who had moved from suicide bombing into rocket deployment, because suicide bombing was now stopped by all the fences and walls that Israel had built. Now the Iron Dome made those missiles less and less effective. Because of the disproportionate number of casualties on the Palestinian side and allegations of Israeli use of white phosphorus, a number of international parties have routinely criticized Israel for the way that it has dealt with the situation in the Gaza Strip. And so there's a discussion in Israel, an ongoing discussion, which increasingly seems to go towards the right, literally. I arranged these pictures from left wing to right wing, but has increasingly gone to the right in terms of dealing with the Palestinian situation. On the left, you have the Geneva Initiative of 2003, which was proposed by Israeli socialist MP. He's from the party of Meretz. His name is Yossi Belin, and a number of individuals from the PLO that never had serious authority. And this would be a two-state solution with certain land swaps, including a divided Jerusalem. And that was the Geneva Initiative of 2003. The idea of dividing Jerusalem is deeply resisted by both Israelis and by Palestinians, because both of them see it as a city that belongs to them. Although the Palestinians are more open to dividing Jerusalem if it's divided along the 1967 borders, which would give the Palestinian state all of the old city and significant parts of the modern city. Another discussion is whether or not perhaps Israel should be something like Switzerland, with a cantonal system where the cantons have a significant degree of autonomy, and there should be a number of Arab cantons, there should be a number of Jewish cantons, and there should also be a number of joint cantons that are mixed, Jewish and Arab population, or Jerusalem itself, which would be a unique canton of itself. And this federal movement would have a number of different laws that would apply. It would be a very messy situation from an organizational perspective, but it would allow Jews and Arabs to live, at least functionally, in one cooperative state. But the dominant perspective is what Caroline Glick called the Israeli solution, which is that Israel leaves the Gaza Strip, which I put in that circle, as an independent Palestinian entity ruled by Hamas or the PLO or whoever the Palestinians choose to rule them, but the West Bank is completely annexed. And it seems increasingly like Israel is moving towards that solution. Ironically, the biggest impediment towards Israel implementing that solution is one of the things I'm going to discuss in a bit, which is the Abraham Accords. But in the Israeli solution, the amount of Arabs in the West Bank would change Israeli demographics significantly. Israel is currently about 80% Jewish and 20% non-Jewish. If the West Bank were annexed outright and all of the Palestinian Arabs living there were made citizens, Israel would become roughly 2/3 Jewish, or 67% Jewish. It would no longer be 80% Jewish. And so that brings into question whether or not the Jews could maintain a majority long-term. Now, one of the things I wanted to discuss a little bit was Zionism as a Jewish practice. So we've talked about before within the Orthodox community the difficulty of accepting Zionism full stop. You have the Datei Leumi community, that religious Zionist community, but by and large, Zionism in the religious sphere is limited because of the history of not accepting any Jewish national movement until the Messiah comes. Within liberal strands of Judaism, however, there is a willingness to incorporate Zionism into Jewish practice and Jewish belief. Probably the foremost way of doing that is the, quote, prayer for the state of Israel, end quote, which was published by the Israeli government and circulated among Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative synagogues in the United States, adopted by most. Although there has been resistance lately in using it, primarily because of the current trends in the Israeli government that seem to be eroding civil liberties within Israel. But one of the interesting things I sort of want to point out, that the prayer for the state of Israel has a number of religious Zionist imagery. You have things like, for example, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu in the end of the first line, meaning the beginning of the end of our exile, right? Which follows in the view of Rabbi Abraham Kook that Israel would be the forerunner of a halachic Jewish state that would be the end time state. So you can see that integration with this prayer. You also see in many conservative Reform and Reconstructionist synagogues in the United States the incorporation of an Israeli flag in the display on the dais. They'll often also have an American flag, right? Most of these congregations are based in the United States. Liberal Judaism, by and large, is an American movement at this point in history. Historically, it also existed in Germany, but Jews in Germany, the original Jewish German community, didn't really survive the Holocaust. The modern Jewish German community is primarily imported from Russia. So liberal Judaism is currently an American phenomenon. And accordingly, you can see Israeli flags alongside American flags in those synagogues, showing the degree of nationalization. An interesting point of contrast is that in the United States, you have a large number of Jews who are Jews of color, meaning that we're talking about 10 to 15% of the American Jewish community are Jews who are not of either, who are not of a European Jewish background and who are not from well-attested Sephardic lineages. We're talking about African Americans who are Jews. We're talking about people of mixed race, people of Asian background. Often these are individuals who have converted or are the sons of, and daughters of people who have converted. And this creates a tension with the state of Israel, because those life cycle rituals that are in the provenance of the Orthodox, and the Orthodox in many cases don't recognize the conversion or don't recognize the Jewish legitimacy of those processes within the United States. Now, one of the interesting sort of wrinkles here is that the Israeli law of return of 1950 operates based on a number of principles, of which conversion is an accepted means of becoming a Jewish citizen. And so a convert who is a Jew of color can become an Israeli citizen under the law of return. However, such a person who converted under a non-Orthodox means can't, for example, get married in the state of Israel, because the Orthodox will not recognize that person as a Jew, and only religious marriages are permitted in Israel. In fact, this is also a similar issue for interreligious marriages in Israel, that people will generally go to a foreign country, get married there, and then come back to Israel. And gays and lesbians who want to get married similarly have to go abroad and get those marriages. But this creates a lot of tension between the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community. And of course, another source of tension is those Orthodox Jews who continue the traditional Jewish view, which is that any Jewish polity without the Messiah is an act of blasphemy. And you can see Neturei Karta, who represents that position. Of course, as I said, that position is a minority position now. Since the 1960s, the majority of the Orthodox communities have sided with Israel being a legitimate entity as a state of Jews. I also have a comment that points out that a number of Jews of color are Jews of color because of adoptions. So we then shift into the Syrian civil war. And I'm not going to cover the intensity of that war. That is going to be its own discussion, because it is very complex. But the Israeli position in it isn't. The worry that the Israelis have is that the Iranians are using the opportunity to get more and more of their own weapons, more and more of their own fighters into Syria for a possible land-based assault on Israel in the future. To wit, they've been creating effectively a corridor from Iran through Iraq through Syria to get to Israel. And so Israel has launched several surface-to-air missile systems that have attacked areas around Damascus when those areas were held by militants. Syria accordingly has fired missiles at Israel and Israeli positions, and Israel has launched attacks on Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders, IRGC, who have been operating within the Syrian context. The most famous of which was General al-Haddadi, who was killed in January 2015. Now, these airstrikes that Israel is flying over Syria are in coordination with the Russians, because the Russians have the largest air superiority and have been supporting Assad during this period. For those who are sort of wondering in the back of their minds why Israel is not taking a more pro-Ukrainian stance in the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia, this is explicitly why. The Israelis need, for their own security, to coordinate with the Russians over Syria, and believe that going to war with Russia on the Ukrainian side, either simply by providing Ukraine arms or actually going to war, would prevent that kind of communication. And that's critical for these operations to continue. Another piece during the war is that Israel had a humanitarian policy in the Golan Heights of receiving any person who crossed the border for injuries, regardless of affiliation. So there are cases where Israelis have helped jihadists from Islamic State, as well as members of the Assad regime, members of the various different rebel groups. So that's also been part of Israel's participation in the Syrian civil war. But Israel has, generally speaking, avoided putting down land forces in Syria, and avoided exacerbating tensions along its border. And finally, one thing to bring up are the Abraham Accords. Now, one of the interesting pivots here in terms of Middle Eastern peace is that the Abraham Accords don't require Israel to give up something. They require the United States to give up something. And this was an innovation that Jared Kushner and Trump brought to the process. Say what you will about their domestic policies in the United States, this was a very innovative move with regards to the Israeli peace process. In particular, Donald Trump secured increased military assistance to the Bahrainis and the Emiratis in exchange for recognizing Israel as a state. And we can also see that the Emiratis were chomping at the bit to have relations with Israel because of Israeli technologies that the Emiratis believe could be instrumental for their economy, especially those in Dubai, who are trying to diversify their portfolio beyond petrochemicals and general resource extraction. Now, the other key point to make here is that these countries in the Persian Gulf would not have been able to make this peace treaty with Israel if it had not been for two major factors. The first one is that Saudi Arabia must implicitly sign off on this. And in fact, there's been an incredible degree of cooperation between Israeli and Saudi officials, despite the fact that Israel and Saudi Arabia do not have normalized relations. All of this has been in reaction to Iran, and given Israel's consistent attacks on Iranian positions in Syria, Saudi Arabia has seen Israel as an ally in that struggle. That said, Saudi Arabia itself can't make peace with Israel because of how conservative its own population is, and they've effectively made their red line an independent Palestinian state. When that happens, they'll open up and normalize with Israel. Because the Bahrainis and Emiratis want to strengthen relations with Israel, they have actually been key in promoting the Palestinian cause within an Israeli context. And it's because of them and them threatening to withdraw the Abraham Accords that Netanyahu, in many respects, has been prevented from annexing the West Bank directly. The Abraham Accords have also been expanded. In December of 2020, Jared Kushner led a delegation of Americans to Morocco to see if Morocco could join the treaty. And what he was willing to give up on the United States side was the failure to recognize Western Sahara as part of Morocco. And so starting from that point on, he recognized the Moroccan right of sovereignty over the Western Sahara, which they annexed in 1975. The international position, generally speaking, has been to regard Morocco's annexation as illegal and contrary to international law. But with this concession from the United States, the Moroccans were willing to make peace with the State of Israel and begin bilateral relations. Historically, Morocco had a policy with regards to Moroccan Israelis that they would give them Moroccan passports and allow them to come to Morocco under that assumption. That may well change in the future. And currently, Sudan is attempting to become part of the Abraham Accords, which is an interesting reversal of the 1967 Khartoum resolution, right? The three no's, no recognition. But now in Khartoum, you can see the Israeli foreign minister meeting Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the military general who took control of Sudan after their own revolution only a few years ago. As late as February of 2023, they were beginning to iron out the parameters of several loans that Burhan was going to get from the United States to pay off the IMF and to remove Sudan from the list of terror states. So the recognition hasn't yet happened, but it is currently in the process of being developed. So questions, comments, clarifications, we already got some. And we also have a point that the Saudis received the cell phone information for Khashoggi from the Israelis. I'm not familiar with that, so I leave it up to you to determine the veracity. All right. So who are we and what do we do? This is Middle Eastern Islamic History. I'm Richard. And on Wednesdays at 7 p.m., I take us through the history of the Middle East. Next week, we're going to talk about Palestinian history. And it's not going to just be a repeat of what you heard tonight, because Palestinians exist in more than just in relation to Israel. We're going to talk about their culture and their history in an Israeli context and also outside of an Israeli context. Palestinians in Jordan, Palestinians in Kuwait, Palestinians in the United States, Palestinians in other places of the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon. So that's going to be Middle Eastern history. We also have a course on Asian philosophy that's taught by Jason Peng. Periodically, Aaron and I do a series on European Union security. Monthly, Jane and John do discussions on powerful women and dead languages, respectively. And periodically, we also discuss the Russo-Ukrainian War. And have a number of tours. We also have older series, all of which you can see on our YouTube page, and you have all the information below to subscribe. So we have a comment in response to the issue of Khashoggi's murder. It's possibly Pegasus was used to track Khashoggi and his allies. And Pegasus is an Israeli spyware surveillance software. All right, so we've got a few questions. So the first question is, why did Herzl try to start a homeland in the Middle East? And might that have been a mistake? Alaska would have been better. Herzl was not set on the question of where a Middle Eastern homeland where a Jewish homeland should be. And there were numerous different discussions about where that could be. There were discussions about putting it in Uganda. There were discussions about putting it in Madagascar. There were discussions about putting it in southern Argentina. And there were discussions about putting it where it is today. And Herzl was not a religious person, so he wasn't concerned with the religious posterity. However, it's much easier to claim the legitimacy of creating a Jewish state in a place where there is Jewish history and Jewish indigeneity than in some random part of the world. So that was one argument that he found particularly convincing from the other members of the World Zionist Congress. Another argument, so you also had a number of individuals who were inspired by the religious connection. And therefore, the World Zionist Congress, as early as the 1900s, was very much interested in doing so, in creating a Jewish state within the territory of the Mandate Palestine. And so the Balfour Declaration, when it was coming, was already a fait accompli. The Zionist movement was already concentrated on doing the creation of a Jewish homeland in the traditional homeland of the Jews. Okay, so now there's a question of whether this seminar series will end. My plan is to sort of get us to July or August, and after that point, I should cover everything that I want to cover, and that will probably get us to the present day on all the other countries, right? So I've finished with Israel, right? Today we did everything that is going to be Israeli, but there are a lot of other countries in the Middle East, and I sort of want to get them to the present as well. The next question is, who are the Hasidic Jews? Who are the Orthodox Jews, and what differentiates them from others? Okay, so the difference between Hasidic Jews and other Orthodox Jews is it starts in the 18th century. So within Poland, you have large numbers of Jewish communities that are relatively illiterate. Relatively is a strong word here. When compared to the Christian population, they were all very literate, but relative to other Jewish populations, they were less so. And they became shamanistic, if we can use this word, in terms of how they perceived the world. They believed that there were certain individuals who possessed a magical connection to nature, to the spirits. Now, of course, Hasidic people won't characterize this way. This is an anthropological characterization. And these people who had this shamanistic connection to reality were called Rebbe, not rabbi, Rebbe, different role. Probably the most famous Rebbe was the Baal Shem Tov. And these individuals would go around and speak in something similar to a Buddhist koan, where they would be able to connect to people on personal issues and other similar issues. And their view was that Judaism should be a celebrated thing. There were lots of dances, a lot of songs, and they stressed much less the dogmatic approach to Talmudic Judaism that had been, let's say, dominant throughout history. And this view was deeply opposed by those who called themselves mitnagdim, or the opposition, who were connected to the yeshivas. Probably the most famous of these mitnagdim was the Vilna Gaon, who was a rabbi based in the city of Vilnius in modern-day Lithuania. And so these two movements fought each other ideologically for most of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. When faced with the growth of liberal Judaism, we're talking about conservative Judaism. It was known then as the progressive historical school, or the positive historical school. The Reformed Jewish school, and numerous others, they decided to put aside their differences and sort of come together. So the Hasidic movement began to take on certain more stringent religious aspects from the mitnagdim, and the mitnagdim allowed a number of the songs and ritualistic behaviors, but not any of the shamanistic behaviors from Hasidism to influence them. But one of the fundamental differences between these two groups, even as they were beginning to coalesce and organize together, is that the Hasidic Jews believed that modernity was the enemy, that modernity was going to strip Jews of all of their religious tradition, all of their religious history. So based on whenever that movement was formed and crystallized, that became the way that they would continue to interact with the world. That's why, for example, Hasidim wear long cloaks, just as they did in Poland, in places that are substantially warmer than Poland, than like the United States or in Israel, because they saw the clothing, the change of clothing, as an act of modernity. And they wanted to stop modernity from infecting them and perhaps limiting their engagement with Judaism. Within the Orthodox world, there was a division on this question. And there were the modern Orthodox, such as those who founded Yeshiva University in New York, for example, who believed that there could be a parity between science and development and a continuing faith to Orthodox Judaism. Which is why, for example, the slogan of Yeshiva University is Torah Umada, right? Torah and science. You have a different contingent of the Orthodox community, which feels more strongly like the Hasidim, of disconnecting. And so many of their traditions seem more like Hasidic traditions because they stay further afield, but they don't, for example, constrain their dress. And they don't, for example, live in exclusively insular communities. So those are really the differences. And for example, the Datei Leumi are all Orthodox, but none of them are Hasidic. So there's a difference there. I hope that's helpful. There's a question of how has the coalition of parties affected the issues facing the Israeli government? One of the main issues with a government like the United States, where you have two parties, is creating unity within a single party. You have a number of different individuals, right? If we talk about the United States context, who make up, for example, the Democratic Party and who make up the Republican Party. And those individuals can have widely disparate policies, such that a Democrat in Mississippi is probably further right-wing than a Republican in Connecticut. Though, like, that is because of how far left the population in Connecticut is. And so being a Republican in Connecticut, if you want to get 50% of the vote, you have to be relatively left-leaning. And the same in Mississippi. If you want to be a Democrat in Mississippi, you have a large right-wing population. So you have to be relatively right-wing to be able to even be within striking distance of 50%. And so in a two-party system, people are electing the human being. In a multi-party system like Israel, people are electing the party. The party stands for one thing. And so since you have a diversity of perspectives, you have a diversity of parties as opposed to a diversity of humans. And this has meant that Israel has never had a situation where one party has had over 50% or anything even close to 50% of the seats, and so has had to operate in a coalition. The coalition that existed in the early days of the state was generally a left-wing coalition. Now it's generally a right-wing coalition. And The difficulty, though, is that the anchoring party may set a significant number of the policies, but the minor parties that create the coalitions can add their policies almost as like the cost of admission. And so what ends up happening typically is that the smaller parties that join with these larger anchoring parties are religious parties. Things like Agudat Yisrael that I mentioned earlier, things like Shas, which is the Sephardic equivalent of that. These parties generally get 8 or 10 seats out of the 120 seats. So minority parties, they couldn't rule in their own right, but they could be the 10 seats needed to get a right-wing coalition from 52 to 61, which is the majority, and then they can rule in their own right. And so these groups have generally had several specific requirements, most of them relating to military exemptions for religious individuals, and that has effectively retarded Israel's ability to deal with the growing religious population in terms of their further assimilation to wider society, and in terms of how they're going to deal with a population that is very much subsidized by Israel's welfare system. There's another question here of if Palestine is a state. I'm definitely going to talk about that a lot more tomorrow, but the simplest answer to that is, if we're talking about a state run by Arabs based in some area of the former Mandate of Palestine, has there been a Palestinian governing apparatus? Prior to 1988, no. There was no such entity. There were a number of governments that were Arab-run that were in Palestine, but all those governments were subordinate governments. For example, Jund Palestine in the 700s was a military district of the the military district of the Umayyad Empire, and it roughly corresponds with the northern half of the former Mandate of Palestine. But that was not its own independent entity. So in 1988, the Palestinian Authority issues a declaration of independence in Tunisia, and it's recognized at that point by about 80 or so countries. There had been earlier recognition of Palestine by groups like the Arab League, but that was usually sort of a fig leaf. There wasn't really interaction with those Palestinian representatives. It wasn't a real thing. So in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed and Palestinian civil control was granted in zones A and B subject to Israeli military control, the Palestinian Liberation Organization became the Palestinian Authority, which was a governing apparatus. It had a legislature made of a number of representatives, most from Fatah, but some from others in coalition. But in 2006, right, that election that put Hamas as the majority of the Palestinian Authority, since that point, the Hamas has been ejected from the parliament because of the Palestinian Civil War of 2006. Of 2007, and Fatah basically rules as a one-party state, and they do rule. They do collect taxes. They do have their own police that are trained by Jordanians. They have most of the requirements of sovereignty that we would think of. The only one I can think of that they really don't have is they don't make their own money. They use Israeli shekels. But within those major cities, they create the laws and they have a monopoly on force. In fact, if you end the West Bank, there is a sign in English and in Hebrew saying that under Israeli law, Israelis can no longer protect you if you go in there. And so Israeli citizens are forbidden from entering. So that should give you a clue as to whether they're sovereign. And Hamas is operating as a Palestinian state since 2007 in the Gaza Strip. They control everything. They control the schools, they control the hospitals, they control the police, they control every aspect of society is controlled by Hamas there. It's a totalitarian state. and a jihadist state, as we discussed in episode, actually, as we discussed last week in our part 2 of jihadism. So those are Palestinian states. And we can also talk about, for example, and we're going to talk about it next week, of the states within a state, for example, in Jordan or in southern Lebanon, where Palestinians created areas where the national government was less powerful than the local governments that they had created. There's a question as to why is there never-ending conflict and hatred? I think it's self-reinforcing. People, at a fundamental level, the never-ending conflict and hatred, people center it on the Middle East, but it doesn't have to be the Middle East. I think the Irish conflict, if you want to think about it, right, you have this constant hatred between Catholics and Protestants because of the way that Northern Ireland was settled by the British, how it was occupied by the British, how the indigenous Irish population was repressed, and their resources extracted. You have all these kinds of things that keep building on themselves. And so they create a cycle of violence and retribution. And I don't think that that's unique in the Israeli case vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and I don't think that it is eternal. We have numerous cases where long-term hatreds have subsided because of changing geopolitical winds. I think a perfect example would be anti-Slavism in much of Western Europe. There was a strong anti-Slavic feeling in the 19th century, considering those people backwards and undeveloped and unintelligent and all these wonderful terms. And then now we're in the 21st century and Slavs are considered the bulwark of democracy. So I don't really see this thing being interminable. I think it just needs better management, and it needs the elevation of individuals who are going to de-escalate the situation rather than escalate the situation. And I don't see that happening from the Israeli side, and I don't see that happening from the Palestinian side. So it's going to take a long time, but it's not intractable. There's a question, does the Iranian Revolution have anything to do with the residual effects of Mossadegh being overthrown? Here's the relevant slide. Okay, so in the period that Mossadegh took power in 1951, he was prime minister of Iran, and the Shah simply abdicated power, and Mossadegh used that opportunity to nationalize the oil fields. This is a situation where I think the United States and the United Kingdom would have been better served by letting Mossadegh do this than trying to overthrow him and reinstate the Shah, because he was socialist, but he was not necessarily communist. That said, because the Shah was reinstated, a lot of the nationalization was undone, and a lot of the humiliation began. And you had parties like the Tudeh, which was the Communist Party of Iran, and a number of other left-wing parties, groups that were feminist aligned, student aligned, the rest of them, secularists, were subject to intense repression from the Shah. There was one area of life where the Shah really couldn't intervene in terms of repressing organization, and that was within the mosque. As we've discussed in several of the Iran episodes in the past, I think episode 52 in particular, there's a concept of bast, or sanctuary, within Iranian mosques. And so Iranian mosques became a place where politics were discussed in a way that the regime couldn't touch. And that gave a benefit to the Islamists in terms of organizing and coordinating, where the secularists didn't have a similar kind of space where they could talk freely. The other piece that's worth taking into account is that by 1979, when the Shah was overthrown and he abdicated in January, Ayatollah Khomeini came back from France in February of 1979. But in January of 1979, the Western parties who met in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, they came to the conclusion that they would rather have the Islamists be victorious in Iran than have the communists, the Tudeh party, being victorious in Iran, because that would be an expansion of Soviet influence. So what you end up happening is that they don't object to Khomeini returning, and they don't object to the Islamist parties in Iran until those parties have a clear stranglehold on power. And then when those parties attacked the US Embassy in November of 1979, that sours relations. But by that point, Iran has already fallen into this Islamist peace, and secular politicians who were willing to stand for the first part of the development of the Islamic Republic, like Mehdi Bazargan, resigned from the Iranian government in protest over those actions, effectively handing over the entire reins of the government to the Islamists. So to some degree, it's related to it, but it has to do more with the way the Shah negotiated his return, and has to do with the view of Western parties over the possible communization of Iran. And it has to do with how Khomeini was able to get people together. Okay, so the next question is Israel wary of the encounter with the Russians because of US funding? Israel has managed to straddle the edge of US relations and relations with Russia. Israel has one of the largest Russian populations outside of Russia, and outside of the former Soviet states. So because of that, Israel naturally has a strong Russian-speaking population and the ability to negotiate with Russians in a way that most other people can't. And I think a clarification to the question is Netanyahu reluctant to start an alliance with Putin? There was even though Israel has that connection with Russia, Israelis have a very different political outlook than Russians. Israel, and in particular, Russians are depoliticized and willing to live under a repressive government. Israelis are highly politicized, and if the current protests in the streets over the proposed judicial reforms is any indication, Israelis would not accept, as a general rule, that sort of livelihood, and they certainly wouldn't accept being a vassal state of Russia, which is sort of what Russia's politics are at this point. They want to create spheres of influence. So Israel's not considering an alliance with Russia by any means, but they are friendly with Russia to the extent that they cooperate with them, and they need that cooperation for their national security. Historically, as we pointed out with the War of Attrition, the Soviet Union was anti-Israeli. So the thaw in Russo-Israeli relations at the end of the Cold War has been a benefit to Israel, and Israel wants to maintain that sort of lukewarm situation that they have. The United States isn't worried about Israel forming an alliance with Putin simply because there's just not enough alignment there. And Israel knows that the relationship that it has with the United States is key for Israel replenishing its military supplies. In particular, during a number of the Gazan wars, Israel has required U.S. munitions to keep pressing those wars. So I don't think the U.S. is worried about Israel leaving. And at the same time, Israel helps subsidize a number of American defense contractors. So that relationship is still going to continue working. Is Netanyahu considered a nationalist? I don't know anybody in Israeli politics on the Jewish side, other than the Orthodox parties, who aren't nationalists. Both Labor and the revisionist Zionists are nationalists. They believe in Israel being a Jewish state. If we're using the term nationalist to describe something else, then I don't know exactly what we're talking about. But if we're talking about, is Netanyahu considering expanding Jewish presence in the West Bank, is Netanyahu in favor of elevating the Jewish population above other non-Jewish populations in Israel, a Judaizer, that's usually the term that's used in this context, in favor of Judaization, then yes, I would say Netanyahu is a Judaizer. He's in favor of a certain degree of Jewish supremacy within the state. I don't think that he is as Jewish supremacist as Meir Kahane. I think Meir Kahane is sort of, and Kahane Chai is in its own sort of bubble, and sort of less Jewish supremacist than them would be Yisrael Beitenu, which is led by Avigdor Lieberman, and Naftali Bennett's National Home. I think both of those are more in favor of Judaization than is Benjamin Netanyahu. But Netanyahu is part of that coalition. And so he endorses a number of those views as sort of the cost of bringing aboard National Home. Is Netanyahu expanding the military and industrial base? Yes. I don't think he's doing it especially much. Israel has consistently had a decentralized industrial development ever since the 1980s, as we discussed with the changing of the economy. So I don't think that he's doing anything that's militarily expansionist or industrially expansionist that's out of order or a unique situation relative to him in Israeli history. Next question is, Herod the Great was an ethnic Arab, I believe. Herod was not an ethnic Arab. He was an Edomite. Now, there's sort of a question about whether Edomites could be considered Arabs. I think that at that point, Arab culture, it could go either way. But he was a Jew by conversion. The Edomites have been forcibly converted to Judaism in the previous centuries. And so Herod was an ethnic Edomite, but a religious Jew, and that's why the Romans were willing to accede to him becoming the leader of Judea under Roman control. Is it a Muslim-Jewish divide, or is it the separate ethnic divide that's driving the Palestinian-Israeli separatism? It's an ethnic divide. As we pointed out, the Israelis have made inroads with a number of different groups. The Circassians and Bedouins are both Sunni Muslims. The difference is that they have a different historical relationship with the settled Arab population. And so that was a situation. And of course, the Christians, both Christian Arabs and Christian Armenians, generally tend to lean pro-Palestinian. So but the Druze, who are a post-Islamic sect, tend to lean pro-Israeli, or in the case of the Golan Heights, pro-Syrian. So they're outside of the Israeli-Palestinian debate. So it's not a Muslim-Jewish divide. It's an ethno-nationalist question where you have two different ethnicities who want different aspirations and governance, and as a result, they want two different states. The only problem is that they seem to want the same territory, and that doesn't work. You can only one state can control one territory. So that's the fundamental issue at this point. The next question is, can you please describe the difference between Sunni and Shiite Muslims? I did that much more in depth in episode 3 and episode 1, and episode 4 as well. But the simplest answer is that there was a succession debate after Muhammad died, and the Sunnis believe that the most capable person should do it, and the Shiites believe that it should be Ali and the direct biological successors of Muhammad who should do it. But that difference and the actual religious differences between Sunni and Shiite Muslims don't really matter, because the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites, is not an international conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. It happens, for example, Hamas is supported by Shiite Iran. You have Shiite Azerbaijan and Shiite Iran being on opposite sides of that because of political issues. You have Kurds who are united despite being Sunni and Shiite. You have a lot, like, for example, the Faili Kurds who are Shiite, and the majority of Kurds in northern Iraq are Sunni, but they don't see any daylight between them. So it's not a universal Sunni-Shiite conflict. That's number one. And the second one is that the majority of what's motivating the animus in any particular instance is the particular history between those two groups as seen as ethnicities. So if we go back to the Ireland example, and I love the Ireland example because it's very relatable. There's that famous joke of a man is driving down the road and he gets pulled over by an Irish cop, and the Irish cop says, are you a Catholic or are you a Protestant? And the man says, I'm an atheist. He says, okay, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? Because the point isn't that the person is religious, right? The point is that the person is part of an ethnic category. The religion is functioning as an ethnic category. And so Catholic and Protestant are stand-ins for part of the Irish independence movement, seeking an Irish republic free from British control, all of those kinds of things. And Protestant is in favor of union with the United Kingdom, in favor of Protestant control, in favor of further United Kingdom intervention in Ireland, all these kinds of things. And so Sunni and Shiite are used in the Middle East in much these same ways. If we look at Yemen, for example, Shiite tends to be affiliated with North Yemen. Sunni tends to be affiliated with South Yemen. And these two groups have been historically ruled differently through much of the 19th and 20th centuries, and even earlier when they were city-states. But because of those wars, Sunni and Shiite become useful labels to say, I'm connected to the North and the political aspirations of Sana'a, or I'm connected to the South if I'm Sunni, and I'm connected to Aden. So both of these terms are functioning as ethnic markers, not as religious markers. I hope that's helpful. In the intervening period, from a religious perspective, other religious developments have separated these two groups, such as in the Sunni world, you have a decentralized authority with the removal of the caliph. And so different religious communities operate relatively independently. Within the Shiite world, you have the Ayatollah, which are these, and Marja, which are Shiite religious authority figures, who are rulers of entire territories from a religious perspective. Think of like an archdiocese from a Catholic perspective, or a patriarchate from an Orthodox Christian perspective. The Shiites have a parallel in this with the Ayatollah, who controls a certain amount of territory from a religious perspective. Sunnis just don't have that. But these religious differences, as I pointed out, are really irrelevant from a understanding of the Middle Eastern situation. Any other questions before we head out? All right, I think then that covers everything. Thank you everybody for asking all those wonderful questions. That was really exciting, and I'm glad that you guys enjoyed this. I hope that you come to my upcoming sessions. Remember, every Wednesday, you can find it in our YouTube. And again, PayPal donations are always appreciated. And I'll see you next week. Bye. And thank you for all the kind words.